A flight attendant harassed a black teen mid-flight, but when his father stepped in, federal authorities swarmed the runway, and the entire crew went silent. He slammed a black teen's head against the window, thinking no one would intervene. He didn't realize the father was ready, and federal marshals were already on their way. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always meets unstoppable authority. The shoulder hit first. Grant Helker brushed past the row with deliberate force, his pressed uniform barely rustling as a shoulder clipped the edge of Jalen Merrick's seat. The 17-year-old jolted slightly, his pencil dragging an unintended line across the sketch he'd been quietly working on. He glanced up, confused, his headphones still snug over his ears, the sound of ambient piano music muffling the world outside. Across the aisle, Grant didn't even look back. He simply kept walking, his spine straight, his jaw tight, his eyes already scanning the next row as if nothing had happened. Elias Merrick saw it. He didn't move. Not yet. His gaze followed the flight attendant with practiced calm, the way a chess player watches an early pawn shift. From the corner of his eye, he noted the crease forming between Jalen's brows, the quiet disruption now etched in graphite on the boy's notepad. Elias leaned back in his seat and took a slow breath. Observation first, action later. The hum of the engines blended with the low murmur of passengers settling in. Afternoon light streamed through the oval windows of the cabin, golden and warm, casting a muted sheen over row 3. Jalen adjusted in his seat, tugging at the edge of his hoodie and glancing once toward the aisle, unsure whether to feel slighted or simply inconvenienced. Elias didn't speak, but he watched. Grant returned within minutes, this time slower. His steps were steady, controlled, like someone executing a mental checklist. As he passed by row 3 again, his head tilted slightly. "Keep your kid in check," he muttered low, his lips barely moving, eyes flicking sideways but never meeting Elias's directly. It was a whisper, meant to sting without echoing. Jalen's posture straightened. He pulled his headphones down around his neck. "What?" he asked, not in anger, but confusion. Elias raised a hand subtly, signaling silence. His voice was quiet but firm. "We're not doing this today," he said, eyes still locked on Grant's retreating form. "Not this time." Jalen blinked. The tension in the air wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It crept in like cold air beneath a door, uninvited, chilling, undeniable. Elias recognized the pattern. The too smooth uniform, the clipped tone, the slight glance at the sneakers. Jalen's left foot had been resting loosely against the window panel's lower ledge. A common habit, harmless. But to Grant, apparently, it was something to catalog. Across the cabin, Grant lifted a hand to his service comm and whispered something indecipherable. Elias noted the gesture, the angle of his head, the timing. The movement didn't match any routine in-flight task. It wasn't an update on beverage service or a request for refueling status. It was personal. Jalen turned toward his father, his voice lower now. "Did I do something?" Elias shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You didn't." The silence that followed was thick, not heavy. It held weight, but not fatigue. It was the kind of silence Elias knew too well, strategic, watchful, necessary. He had spent years analyzing microbehaviors in conference rooms, tribunals, and covert interviews. But nothing demanded precision like a moment unfolding in real time, with your child beside you, and the wrong kind of authority watching from across the aisle. Grant's movements were precise as he disappeared toward the galley. Another attendant passed by, eyes indifferent, unaware, or choosing to be. Jalen tapped his pencil against the edge of the tray table, the sketch now abandoned. It showed a partial rendering of a city skyline, interrupted by the errant line from earlier. A visual echo of a moment that didn't belong. Elias tapped his index finger once on his thigh, a subconscious habit he did when mentally timing escalation. Grant returned again, this time pushing the beverage cart, but his pace didn't slow near row 3. He served row 2A and 2B. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water for the elderly man across the aisle, then moved straight past Elias and Jalen without a word. Jalen's brows furrowed. "Excuse me, could I get some water?" he asked politely, leaning forward. Grant stopped, turned. "You'll wait your turn like everyone else," he snapped. Not loud, but sharp. Passengers around them shifted slightly, like leaves catching a breeze. Subtle, but definite. Elias remained seated, calm. He asked respectfully, he said, his voice measured. Grant ignored him. His cart rolled forward. Jalen slouched back, pulling his hoodie up halfway. "It's fine," he muttered. "No, you're not," Elias replied, eyes still on Grant. A subtle beep sounded overhead, the seatbelt sign returning due to mild turbulence. A nudge of movement ran through the aircraft, the kind that didn't shake cups but reminded everyone they were in the sky. The cart was stowed quickly. Grant, however, circled back. He stopped in front of row 3 again, this time standing over them. "Your son's feet are blocking the emergency latch," he said flatly. Elias didn't move. "There's no latch on this window. It's a fixed panel," he replied evenly. I said, "Feet up." The words dropped like weights. Jalen slowly pulled his feet back. Grant lingered another second too long, his gaze holding Elias's. Not a challenge, a test. Elias's thoughts moved faster than his expression. Something's being set up, he realized. The pattern wasn't random, it was orchestrated. He glanced once toward the overhead panel and saw it. A faint green light that hadn't been there earlier. Someone had activated a cabin override, an internal communication route used in select circumstances. Situations that usually required justification later. And Grant was already building his. In the aisle across, a passenger casually held up a phone angled toward them, pretending to scroll, but clearly recording. Good, Elias thought. Eyes help, but they also delay. He felt the tension constricting like thread around a pulse. His instincts weren't wrong. Not with behavior like Grant's. Not with the silence after every pass. Not with the precise choreography that was too practiced to be coincidence. He turned to Jalen and lowered his voice. "This isn't about the water. Or your shoes." Jalen nodded, uncertain. "Then what?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just leaned back, muscles tight beneath the surface, and whispered again, this time quieter, colder. "Not this time." The cart clattered to a halt beside row 3. Grant Helker, expression tight and eyes sharp beneath his neatly pressed cap, began pouring drinks with robotic precision. But he never looked at Jalen. He skipped the boy entirely. No offer, no glance before moving on. Jalen waited a moment, then leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" he asked, his tone even and respectful. Grant didn't even turn. His hand froze halfway over a can of juice for the next row. Then came the reply, sharp, flat, and loud enough to be heard 2 rows back. "You'll wait your turn like everyone else." The ambient noise of the cabin, the soft hum of engines, the rustle of pages and seatbelt clicks seemed to pause for half a second. A few passengers glanced sideways. The tension, though subtle, had cracked through the surface. Elias Merrick straightened slightly in his seat. His voice, calm and low, followed without pause. "Sir," he asked respectfully. Grant did not reply. He gripped the cart and rolled it forward with more force than necessary, the wheels scraping faintly against the aisle. His shoulder brushed against a man standing up to adjust his overhead bag, but he didn't apologize. As he passed row 4, he brought one hand up to the collar of his uniform and muttered something into the embedded comm unit clip just beneath his lapel. Elias noticed that gesture. He didn't miss the way Grant's eyes darted up to the cabin ceiling before his lips moved. A practice move. A signal. "Mix live," Elias thought grimly. And someone's listening. He turned toward Jalen. The boy had sunk slightly into his seat, trying to appear smaller than he was. His sketchbook remained open on his lap, but the pencil lay idle. "I'm fine," Jalen mumbled without looking up. "No, you're not," Elias replied softly. His fingers drummed once against the fold-down tray, then stopped. His mind was already working ahead, filing details, patterns, intentional escalation, performative dominance, subtle targeting under the guise of policy. A soft ding sounded overhead. The pilot's voice echoed through the speakers, calm and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're anticipating a patch of mild turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. As the cabin shifted gently with the first sign of air disturbance, Grant returned. But this time, he came with no card. No trae, just presence. He stopped beside Jalen's seat and pointed to the floor, his voice sharp. Feet up. Now. Jalen looked confused. His sneakers were barely touching the lower frame of the window wall, not obstructing anything. He adjusted his legs slightly. Sorry, I didn't mean. You're blocking the emergency latch. That's a violation. There's no latch on this window, Elias cut in. His voice carried the kind of certainty that didn't require elevation. This is a sealed panel. We both know that. Grant's jaw clenched. He leaned in closer, one hand bracing against the headrest in front of Jalen. His breath smelled faintly of stale coffee. I said, feet up. Jalen's throat bobbed. He raised his legs obediently, tucking them beneath his seat. Okay, he whispered. But Grant didn't back away immediately. He hovered, as if waiting for some reaction, as if expecting resistance. Elias watched every detail, the clench of the man's jaw, the flare of his nostrils, the slight twitch in his temple. A performance was underway. But it wasn't meant for Elias and Jalen. It was meant for someone else. Across the aisle, a man in his 30s wearing a denim jacket and glasses discreetly lifted his phone, angling it just enough to capture the scene. The camera light didn't flash, but Elias saw the reflection in the man's reading glasses. He was recording. Good. Grant finally stepped back, but not before casting a glance upward again toward the overhead panel, where a dim amber light had now been activated. A crew override. That wasn't standard. Elias's eyes narrowed. Cabin override protocols weren't accessible from the aisle. Someone from the back galley or cockpit had triggered it, which meant Grant wasn't acting alone. He was laying groundwork, building a case, a narrative. He's setting something up, Elias thought, the pieces falling into place with every flicker of expression. His instincts, honed from years of watching courtroom footage, compliance interrogations, and public ethics trials, lit up like a flare. It's not about a window latch, not about feet. It's bait. Jalen sat still, legs tucked, hands clenched around the pencil resting against his thigh. He didn't speak, but Elias saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his lips pressed together to hold back embarrassment. That expression, shame wrapped in confusion, was all too familiar. Elias reached slowly across the seat divide and touched his son's wrist. A silent message passed between them. You are not the problem. This is not your shame to carry. The plane rocked gently again, this time more pronounced. A ripple of cautious glances passed through the cabin as the turbulence reminded everyone that they were suspended 38,000 feet above solid ground. Grant moved down the aisle, his posture rigid, not a hair out of place, but his eyes, cold and controlled, flicked back one more time toward row 3A. Elias didn't look away. Instead, he leaned slightly forward and spoke under his breath, voice low enough for only his son to hear. He's setting something up. Something's about to go wrong. Without warning, Grant Helker appeared beside row 3, his steps too sharp, too purposeful for a man supposedly responding to turbulence. The seatbelt sign had just flickered back on. The cabin dipped ever so slightly, but his eyes weren't on safety. They were on Jalen. We've had multiple complaints about your son's behavior, Grant said loudly, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. His tone wasn't informative, it was accusatory, meant to draw eyes. Elias turned, slowly, measuring the weight of every word and the growing tension in the air. The cabin was quiet, peaceful even. A few passengers glanced up, confused, others paused mid-conversation. No one looked uncomfortable. No one spoke. Name one complaint, Elias replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. He didn't blink. Grant didn't answer. Instead, he clutched his small tablet tighter, then tucked it under his arm as if the question had never been asked. Sir, if you can't manage him, I'll have to call for assistance, he declared, his posture squaring as if he expected resistance. Jalen froze in his seat. His pencil had dropped into the crease of his notebook, his fingers still hovering above the unfinished sketch. His chest tightened. He didn't know whether to speak, to argue, or just shrink into himself. Across the aisle, the man with the phone who'd been filming earlier leaned forward again. He had felt this moment coming and now watched it unravel, silently recording, capturing every heartbeat of injustice. Grant's hand darted down without warning. He yanked Jalen's headphones clean off his head. I said, "Listen when I speak to you." His voice cracked with authority, loud enough to draw a startled gasp from the nearby rows. Jalen winced, stunned by the suddenness. His head jerked slightly as the headphones were ripped away. Elias stood, not rushed, not frantic, just deliberate. "Don't touch my son," he said, his voice low, commanding, deadly calm. "Step back." But Grant didn't move back. He stepped closer. His breath quickened, as if feeding off confrontation. "He's non-compliant," he said, now addressing no one in particular. "I'm authorized to relocate him." Jalen looked at his father, eyes wide, frightened. Elias didn't flinch. His hand moved gently in front of Jalen, a signal of protection and restraint. "You're going to regret this decision," Elias said evenly, never raising his voice, never blinking. Grant's hand shot forward again, this time gripping Jalen's arm. Instinctively, Jalen recoiled, trying to pull free. His elbow knocked against the inner edge of the window frame with a dull thud. It was enough. Grant's arm reeled back, and in a single, horrifying moment, he slammed the side of Jalen's head against the window. The sound was sickening, bone against plexiglass, followed by a smear of sweat and skin left behind on the pane. The cabin erupted in noise. Gasps, shouts, the metallic rattle of tray tables and belts unbuckling. Jalen collapsed sideways in his seat, limp, his hand falling from his sketchbook. His eyes fluttered open for a second, then shut. Elias moved. His hands were swift but controlled as he stepped in front of his son. He didn't strike. He didn't shout in rage. He placed himself between the attacker and the injured. "You assaulted my son," Elias shouted, his voice now rising to meet the storm. "He assaulted my son." Jalen's head struck the cabin window with a sickening thud. The sound was sharp, glass against skull, and for one eternal second, time halted. His sketch pad slipped from his lap, sliding across the floor like an afterthought. Blood smeared against the window pane, thin but immediate, as Jalen slumped sideways in his seat, dazed and blinking. His hand twitched once, then stilled. The pencil he'd been holding rolled toward the aisle. Elias Merrick was already on his feet. He didn't shout. He didn't move like a panicked father. He moved like a man who had trained his entire life for restraint and had now decided that restraint had run out of usefulness. His eyes locked on Grant Helker, the flight attendant standing rigid, panting lightly, his hands still partially outstretched from the impact. A faint tremble in his fingers betrayed him. Elias stepped in front of his son with calm, deliberate purpose. "You just committed a felony on a minor," Elias said, his voice so cold it cut through the heat of the moment. His tone wasn't raised. He didn't need volume. His precision carried more weight than any scream. Grant took a half step back, blinking as if waking from trance. Then his posture stiffened, and he raised his voice for the cabin to hear. He resisted. "I was following safety protocol." He struck the panel. "He leaned against the panel," Elias replied sharply. "And you slammed his head." Several passengers had already risen from their seats. The man who had been filming earlier now moved closer, phone still recording, his hand steady. In row 5, a teenage boy with a cracked voice shouted, "I saw it. He hit the kid." "Sir, please sit," Grant began. But Elias was already reaching for the nearest cabin intercom, mounted just beside the row divider. His finger pressed the speaker button with purpose. There was no hesitation. "This is Elias Merrick," he announced into the microphone. "You have 30 seconds to notify the pilot that a federal ethics officer is invoking immediate flight safety protocol under passenger assault conditions." A shiver moved through the cabin like electricity. Elias's name had weight, and even those unfamiliar with him could tell by the way he stood, rigid, centered, with every syllable pronounced like a blade, that he was not bluffing. Grant's face changed. He didn't speak, but his lips parted slightly as recognition filtered through his panic. "Merrick, That name wasn't just familiar. It was one of those names passed quietly in security briefings and risk assessment summaries. Elias Merrick wasn't just a civilian. He was the author of 3 compliance manuals and a federal officer with clearance no cabin crew should ever challenge. "You don't know what you just started," Elias added, turning his body slightly to shield his son as Jalen stirred beside him, groaning faintly. In the cockpit, co-pilot Damian Krell frowned as the override ping came through. "Code 742 coming from row 3, he muttered, glancing at the status display. "Confirm the source," said the captain, his voice low and taut. "Name attached is Elias Merrick." The captain's hand froze over the throttle. "That Merrick?" "Sir, it looks like him," Krell replied, confirming visual now through rear cam. The confirmation never came from the crew. Instead, the decision was made for them. From row 1, a tall man with a square jaw, dark slacks, and an inconspicuous blazer stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice or rush. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and calmly pulled out a badge, flashing it toward the surrounding passengers and then to Elias. The golden eagle crest and federal seal were unmistakable. He stepped down the aisle with authority and stopped beside Elias, his voice steady. "Dr. Merrick," he said, "I'm assuming you're activating federal escalation protocol?" Elias didn't take his eyes off Grant. "Yes," he said, "and you're about to hear from ground control in under a minute." Behind them, a child began to cry. The intercom chimed, and outside the window, the sun dimmed slightly behind the cloud line, just enough to cast the cabin in an eerie, clinical light. The war had shifted. It was no longer a question of passenger versus crew. It was now a federal matter, and the flight was about to change course. The pilot's voice cracked sharply over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an unscheduled emergency landing due to a reported in-flight incident. Please remain seated." The announcement fell over the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude. Gasps rippled through the rows. Passengers instinctively straightened in their seats, some craning their necks toward row 3, where the stillness had grown heavier than the turbulence. Grant Helker took one step back, his face tight with a mixture of shock and defiance. His fingers, once rigid and commanding, twitched near his waist as if still itching to justify what he'd done. But the air marshal, already moving with unspoken authority, held up a hand and barked, "Do not move, sir." The badge clipped to his chest gleamed in the ambient overhead light, its federal seal needing no explanation. Jalen groaned faintly, the sound muffled and raw. His head lolled slightly to the side, temple marked with a shallow cut that trickled a thin line of blood toward his cheek. Elias caught him gently, sliding an arm behind his neck and steadying him upright with a father's precise tenderness. "You're okay, son," Elias murmured, brushing Jalen's curls back from his forehead. "I'm here." Across the aisle, the man with the phone lowered it momentarily. "I've got the whole thing. Clear as day," he whispered to the marshal, who nodded once. Another man, 2 rows behind, lifted his hand. "I recorded from the side angle too," he said. "Both audio and visual." The marshal gave a sharp nod. "Once we land, you'll submit everything directly to federal agents. No media leaks." "Understood." The irony that settled next was bitter and unmissable. Grant had believed he could control the narrative, twist the optics, weaponize protocol. But he hadn't realized the passenger seated beside Jalen Merrick was Dr. Elias Merrick. And that mistake was already spiraling into something far beyond his comprehension. Back in his seat, Elias reached into the front pocket of his carry-on bag and pulled out a matte black device. It unfolded into a secure tablet, biometric lock blinking once before opening a dashboard. He tapped through an encrypted folder labeled In-Flight Compliance Archive and pulled up the internal cabin footage, data his clearance gave him access to even before disembarkation. He tilted the screen just enough for the man across the aisle to glimpse it. "I knew I'd need these someday," Elias said, his voice calm but steeled by something deeper. The man leaned forward, eyes widening. Are you really that Dr. Merrick? The ethics guy from the summit hearings?" Elias met his gaze without a smile. "Grant Helker," he said flatly, "just picked the wrong flight to stage a power trip." From the cockpit, Landing instructions were already in motion. Attendant Airfield had been alerted. Its emergency runway lights had been activated. Down below, Marshals, airport security, and medical teams mobilized to meet Flight 728. The marshal beside Elias tapped his comm once. Confirmed. Multiple videos, confirmed ID of assaulted minor, and confirmation of in-flight override trigger by ethics officer. The man paused, listening to the reply. Understood. Contain until touchdown. Inside the cabin, the quiet had turned to a tension that vibrated just under the surface of breathing. Jalen's eyes fluttered open again, the blood having stopped but the disorientation clear. He blinked, then looked toward the nearest window. A flicker of light caught his attention. Red and blue strobes, distant but approaching. "Dad," he whispered hoarse. "I see them," Elias replied, gently squeezing his shoulder. As the plane dipped in a final descent, tires soon groaning against the tarmac, every eye seemed locked on the aisle of row 3. Runway crews sprang into view beyond the window, figures in reflective vests darting alongside vehicles. The captain's voice returned, now less firm and more subdued. "We've arrived at Attendant Airfield. Please remain seated until further instructed. Emergency personnel will be boarding shortly." Elias leaned closer to his son, voice steady and soft, but carrying the weight of something absolute. "They're here," he said, eyes never leaving the sealed cabin door ahead. "And now it's over." The cabin door hissed open with a hydraulic exhale, revealing a stark and jarring tableau. 6 federal marshals in dark uniforms standing shoulder to shoulder on the jet bridge, their presence a thunderclap of authority. Behind them stood 2 airport security officers and a trio of medics wheeling a collapsible stretcher, eyes scanning the cabin with grim urgency. The lead marshal, a tall man with silver-threaded hair and a taut jaw, stepped forward without hesitation. Everyone remained seated. His voice boomed, firm but controlled. The cabin fell into a stunned hush. Elias Merrick didn't wait for an invitation. He gently eased Jalen forward, helping him stand despite the boy's dazed, wavering steps. Blood had crusted faintly along his temple, the source matted into the curls above his left ear. Jalen's knees buckled slightly, and Elias caught him. "He needs medical now," Elias said, his voice low but filled with the kind of tension that made the medics instantly move. As the stretcher was brought forward and Jalen lowered carefully onto it, a ripple of murmurs moved through the rows. The marshals didn't glance at the passengers, only at the man who now froze mid-aisle, his posture halfway between protest and panic. "Grant Helker." One of the marshals turned his head. "Grant Helker, by federal directive, you're being placed under immediate custody, pending investigation under Title 49 Aviation Conduct and Passenger Protection Statute." As the handcuffs clicked over Grant's wrists, a gasp rang out from someone in row 7. Another man, still holding his phone aloft, whispered, "He really did it. They actually took him." Then, unexpectedly, a few passengers applauded, brief, scattered claps that stopped almost as quickly as they began. Grant, now pale and visibly sweating, jerked his shoulder back. "This is a protocol violation," he shouted. He resisted. "That boy was non-compliant. I followed escalation orders." The marshal holding him didn't flinch. "That boy," he said flatly, "is a minor, and he was assaulted under surveillance, witnessed, filmed, and contradicted by physical evidence. Speak again, and you'll be charged with obstruction." But it was Elias's voice that made the cabin fall silent again. He hadn't moved from the aisle, his stance calm, arms folded across his chest, voice even and sharp. "I'm a federal ethics officer," he said clearly. "My son was assaulted, and you were caught by 3 angles and 5 witnesses." The hush held like glass, until it cracked with the sound of the stretcher rolling past, Jalen's eyes fluttering open as medics checked his vitals. "You're okay," Elias whispered as he walked beside the stretcher, his voice softening. "I'm here." Passengers began to deplane row by row as instructed, each movement now subdued and cautious. Some avoided Elias's gaze, but others, especially parents, offered small nods of respect. One man, carrying a sleeping toddler, leaned close as he passed and murmured, "You saved more than just your kid today." Elias offered a faint nod in return, his thoughts already racing through procedural options, judicial chains, legal ramifications. But then came the unexpected shift. The real twist folded into the chaos like a second blade. The lead marshal approached again, his tone lower now. "Dr. Merrick," he said, stepping into the narrow aisle. "We just received clearance from the DOJ. There's authorization for a full-scale federal tribunal." Elias's jaw tightened, his mind immediately cataloging implications. "That fast?" he asked, voice barely above a breath. The marshal nodded solemnly. "Because this isn't the first report about Grant Helker. It's just the first with a witness who had clearance, evidence, and credentials airtight enough to bring the system to its knees." Elias looked down the aisle, watching the marshals lead Grant through the forward exit, his protests now hoarse and lost in the clatter of the stretcher wheels, the shuffle of passengers, and the low thrum of engine shutdown. He exhaled slowly, placing a hand over the seat where Jalen had once sat, seat 3A, now smeared faintly with a streak of blood and the shadow of something that had broken beyond bone. "Then let's begin," Elias said. "Let's dismantle this properly." The metal door of the enforcement annex clicked shut behind Elias Merrick, its cold echo reverberating through the sterile corridor. He didn't flinch. Two agents escorted him into a debriefing room lined with soundproof panels and a single long table under recessed lighting. The space smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and urgency. A file sat waiting at the center of the table, a thick, dog-eared binder already opened halfway. But Elias didn't sit. "Not yet." "Dr. Merrick," said Agent Romer, a stout, sharp-eyed man in his 50s. "We weren't expecting this much material." Elias finally moved to the head of the table, set down his satchel, and withdrew a secondary stack of folders, then a flash drive. "This is just the surface," he said. "The rest is cross-referenced digitally and time-stamped." Agent Romer exchanged a look with his colleague, a younger man named Calendaro, who had been hastily taking notes. Elias flipped open the top file. The first page was a redacted incident report dated 18 months prior. Flight, Valorn 362. Allegation, verbal harassment. Accused crew member, Grant Helker. Kellen looked up. "Sir, this report was dismissed." "Buried," Elias corrected. "Dismissed implies it was reviewed fairly." It wasn't. A beat of silence passed before Romer leaned forward. "Are you saying this was part of a pattern?" "I'm saying," Elias replied, voice calm but laden with restrained fury, "that what happened to my son wasn't an isolated failure. It was the end result of a culture designed to protect those in uniform no matter the harm inflicted." Romer sat back slowly. "Go on." Elias moved through the documents with methodical precision. Each folder was a story. Passengers who had filed complaints, only to be gaslight or labeled disruptive. Names were blurred, but dates, crew rosters, and flight logs were clear. Grant Helker's name emerged 3 times, once in a verbal intimidation case involving a minor, once in an alleged physical shove against a senior passenger, and once in a report that mysteriously had no signature and no resolution. That one, Elias pointed, was removed from the official logs. "I recovered it from a mirror data archive stored at the oversight office before I left my last assignment." Kellen whistled under his breath. "So Helker's been protected." "He was," Elias said, turning another page. "Not anymore." A tense quiet followed, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation. Elias didn't sit until he pulled out the final piece. A printed memo, stamped confidential, authored by none other than Director Van Lorick. Romer's brow furrowed as he read the first line. "Grant Helker may need oversight, but complaints of this nature should be handled quietly and without escalation." Romer blinked. "You knew Lorick?" "We debated each other twice in public hearings," Elias replied, his tone now edged. "He argued that authority on aircraft should always favor the crew without question. I argued that unchecked power at altitude is as dangerous as turbulence without warning." Dramatic irony thickened the air. Grant Helker, so confident in his power at 35,000 feet, had built his arrogance on the false foundation of silence. Now that silence was being dismantled by one of the men who had helped design the very ethics system Helker assumed would never turn on him. He once said, Kellen murmured, that passengers have no power at 35,000 feet. Elias looked straight at him. That's exactly what makes them vulnerable, especially when they're young, especially when they're alone. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Romer closed the file and stood. We're moving this to full tribunal proceedings, he said. Effective immediately. We'll need to authenticate everything. I've already done that, Elias replied, tapping the flash drive, including metadata, access logs, and 3 separate chain of custody verifications. Kellen adjusted his chair, visibly shaken. And your son? Recovering, Elias said. Physically, he's stable, but emotionally, he paused, allowing the words to settle. He trusted that adults would do right by him in the absence of his voice. That trust was shattered. Outside the annex, rain had begun to fall, the droplets ticking against the tall, narrow window like a clock counting down to something inevitable. Elias rose and gathered the files. I'll testify, he said. I'll bring every witness I've spoken to. But this time, we do it without red tape. We do it publicly. Romer nodded, already reaching for the phone. We'll set it in motion. Elias turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. One more thing. Yes. That memo from Lorik, Elias said. There are more like it. I know his language. I know his signature patterns. And if we dig deep enough, we'll find out that Grant Helker wasn't a rogue exception. He was a symptom. Romer met his gaze. Then let's root it out. Outside, the corridor lights flickered faintly as Elias stepped back into the hallway, already pulling up a list of names from memory, crew, supervisors, coordinators. He would name them all, one by one, brick by brick. And just before the door closed behind him, Elias said without turning, We're going to name them all, Elias said. Brick by brick, this structure is coming down. He smirked, confident his act would go unnoticed, unaware that every move was being monitored and that backup had already been mobilized. If you believe arrogance under a uniform always collapses when real power arrives, hit subscribe now, because justice never waits. The courtroom went dark, and the video began. Without preamble, the footage played on 3 synchronized monitors, the interior of Flight 728's cabin. Grant Helker's voice rang through the audio feed, harsh, commanding, unmistakably hostile. Then came the moment. On the left screen, Jalen flinched. On the right, Grant's arm lunged forward. And on the center monitor, the full scene unfolded in brutal clarity, Jalen's head slamming sideways into the window with a sickening thud. Gasps rippled across the tribunal gallery. The sound of the impact echoed, then faded into silence. Elias Merrick stood unmoving at the center of the hearing room, wearing a charcoal gray suit, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. He hadn't blinked once through the footage. Across the floor, the prosecution team watched him like a compass needle, silent, alert, ready to follow his lead. He had insisted on showing the video before saying a word. Now the silence was his to fill. Elias stepped forward, adjusted the slim mic on the podium, and said, The cabin isn't just a place of service, it's a place of selective power. The sentence hit the room like a gavel. Every reporter scribbled. A federal ethics board member nodded slowly, jaw clenched. On the front bench, one of the airline's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were precise, deliberate, scalpel, not sword. He continued, At 35,000 feet, the rules are designed to maintain order. But those same rules can be bent to mask misconduct. When power is granted without oversight, it becomes performance. And when that performance is weaponized against a child, it becomes injustice, staged behind a smile. One of the prosecutors handed Elias a clicker. He clicked once, revealing a list of prior complaints against Grant Helker, 7, spanning 5 years. The screen populated with timestamps, dates, and faded notes like passenger overreacted, no further action. Incident resolved on board. 7, Elias said. 7 red flags ignored. Why? because the victims were deemed difficult or disruptive, or, he clicked again, just another overreacting kid. He let the phrase hang in the air. Then, slowly, he turned toward the judges. That's a direct quote, he added. Not from Helker, but from his direct supervisor. The lead tribunal judge raised an eyebrow. Do you have evidence of this? Elias nodded once. Edo. From the folder in front of him, he removed a printed transcript, internal chat logs from Valorn Air's supervisory system. He placed them on the evidence screen. The logs showed a conversation between Director Van Lorik and a regional flight manager named Brinkess. Passenger complaint, seat 14C. Supervisor, Van Lorik, he's just another overreacting kid. Close it out quietly. The courtroom's temperature dropped. It wasn't just a defense crumbling, it was a culture being exposed. Across the aisle, a reporter texted something furiously. Another whispered, "That's the quote." He just gave them their headline. Outside the facility, the story was already erupting. Social media feeds swelled with the phrase overreacting kid. Video clips from the tribunal were live-streamed. Former passengers from unrelated flights began posting their own experiences. One man, a musician, wrote, "He called me disruptive because I asked for water during turbulence. I was 16. Inside the courtroom, Elias paused, breathing evenly, his hand resting lightly on the podium. In a system where uniform equals authority, there must be balance. Otherwise, we mistake fear for compliance. My son complied. He was polite. He followed every instruction. And still he bled. His voice wavered for a split second, but he steadied it. I'm not here as a grieving father, he said. I'm here as a systems analyst. I helped write the original escalation framework for federal airspace protocols. And I'm telling you now, it's broken. Someone behind the defense table murmured. Elias ignored it. His focus sharpened. I submit to this tribunal that Grant Helker's actions were not isolated. They were predictable, enabled by neglect, masked by protocol, and empowered by silence. He clicked once more. The final screen showed a side-by-side comparison. Jalen, sketching in his seat, calm and still, and Grant, leaning over, sneering, moving in too close. Synced audio confirmed no aggression from a boy. No profanity. No raised voice. Just silence, and then a scream. Elias turned one final time toward the judges. My son's rights were not paused at altitude. They were not placed in holding patterns. And they were not invalidated by someone's discomfort with his presence. His rights were grounded the moment Grant Helker was allowed to fly unchecked. He stepped back from the podium, the floor silent again. The prosecution rested its case with a single nod. Back at the hospital, Jalen watched the live stream from his room. Bandages still circled his temple, but his expression was different now, less haunted, more aware. He heard his father's voice through the screen, firm and unwavering. Then came the moment. Elias's final line landed, the tribunal frozen in attention. The most dangerous weapon at altitude is unchecked ego with a uniform. And this time, we're grounding it for good. The courtroom fell into a hush as the presiding official adjusted his glasses and leaned into the microphone. This tribunal finds Grant Helker guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault under federal aviation law, obstruction of ethical procedure, and abuse of in-flight authority against a minor. The words echoed like a bell across the chamber. The press gallery was silent. Elias Merrick sat without blinking, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his posture still. But beneath that stillness, every tendon in his jaw had tightened. He didn't flinch when the gavel dropped. Across the aisle, Grant Helker stood pale and sweating, lips parted as if expecting to object, but unable to find a single defense that hadn't already been dismantled. His attorney leaned in to whisper something, perhaps to urge composure, perhaps to prepare him for sentencing, but Grant didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, as if the world had betrayed him by treating his actions with consequences. But it wasn't just Helker on trial. The real shock came moments later. This tribunal further finds that Valorn Air, represented today by counsel, is liable for institutional failure to act upon multiple documented complaints regarding flight attendant Grant Helker. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Elias looked to the left, where Valorn's corporate attorneys sat stiffly in tailored suits. Not one of them made eye contact with him. "We order that all supervisory personnel tied to these previous complaints be placed under formal federal investigation," the judge continued, beginning with Director Van Lorick. That name landed like a hammer. Elias closed his eyes for a second. A part of him had hoped it wouldn't come to this, that internal course correction could have happened years ago, before Jalen's head met a cabin window. But hadn't. And now, the very scaffolding that had protected Helker was starting to collapse. After the verdict, the courthouse emptied with a quiet swirl of cameras, journalists whispering into their mics, and lawyers moving in practice clusters. But Elias didn't stay for questions. He exited through a side corridor and made his way to the hospital. Jalen sat by the window in his room, sketchbook in hand, pencil barely moving. He wasn't drawing, just tracing, repeating a single line over and over, eyes distant. Elias entered without speaking. He stood beside his son, hands behind his back, watching planes taxi and lift off in the distance. "They'll ask you if it was worth it," Jalen said, voice soft but clear. Elias didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the runway. "It wasn't about worth," he said. "It was about right." Neither spoke after that for a while. But a gentle tension seemed to lift from the room, like a pressure valve easing after holding too much for too long. Later that evening, in the subdued quiet of his hotel room, Elias received an encrypted message on his secure channel from the FAA Oversight Division. It was brief, direct, and startling, requesting formal assistance from Dr. Elias Merrick in the drafting of new federal guidelines for crew conduct escalation protocols. "Your experience and case file from Flight 728 will serve as framework." He stared at the message. A beat passed before he allowed himself to sit. The irony was not lost on him. For years, he'd written theoretical models on ethics, procedural escalation, and institutional accountability. They'd sat in federal filing systems and policy binders, quoted in conferences, occasionally admired but rarely enforced. But now, because his son had been struck hard enough to leave blood on a window, his theories were no longer theories. They were blueprints in demand. He opened a fresh document and titled it simply, "The Merrick Protocol." He began typing. Every regulation must begin with the assumption that passengers are not problems to be managed. They are people to be protected. The cursor blinked after that sentence. Elias stared at it for a long time. The footage had shown everything. The tribunal had confirmed everything. But what changed the tide wasn't just the video. It was the identity of the witness, the clarity of the evidence, the credentials airtight enough to leave no gaps for excuses. Back at the hospital, Jalen stirred again in his sleep. A light knock sounded from the doorframe, and a nurse entered to check his vitals. Elias rose from his chair, moved quietly, and stepped outside to take a call. It was the lead investigator from the tribunal. His voice was calm, but edged with fatigue. "We've already issued the warrant for Van Lorick. You were right. He tried to purge his records. He failed. We found everything." Elias let out a slow breath. "I'm not surprised. What you did," the agent continued, "I've never seen anything like it. You didn't just dismantle a defense. You changed the architecture." "No," Elias replied. "We just revealed the cracks. The system was already broken. Now it's our job to make sure what comes next doesn't collapse the same way." There was silence on the line. The investigator finally said, "What are you going to call it?" "The protocol, I mean." Elias looked through the glass at his son, whose temples still bore a faint bruise, but whose chest rose with steady breath. "It started with a slammed head," Elias murmured, "but it's ending with a blueprint." The envelope arrived unannounced at Elias Merrick's front door, bearing the Valorn Air emblem embossed in silver. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he placed it on the counter beside his son's sketch, the now viral image of Elias shielding Jalen in the narrow aisle of Flight 728. It had been 3 months since that moment in the sky, but the industry had not forgotten. Neither had Elias. Inside the envelope was a formal request from Valorn's new public affairs director. They wanted Elias to serve as a consultant on rebuilding public trust. He read the letter twice, then quietly picked up the sketch and slid it into an envelope of his own. No reply, no words, Just a drawing. It would be answer enough. Meanwhile, Valorn Air scrambled to contain the damage. Over a dozen crew members, including Grant Helker's close associates, were placed on immediate suspension. New internal memos leaked to the press revealed that Valorn had begun rewriting its in-flight escalation policies, adopting the foundational points of the Merrick Protocol. One clause in particular, requiring a neutral safety liaison to immediately review any crew escalation involving a minor, was already being tested at 5 major airports. But behind the headlines, something quieter, more profound was forming. It began with a call from a father in Chicago. His son, 15, had been denied boarding because his tone was deemed confrontational. Then another from Denver, a 16-year-old violinist accused of smuggling tools because he carried a tuning kit in his instrument case. Then a mother from Phoenix whose teenage nephew had been forced to stand for nearly an hour after being falsely accused of tampering with a tray table. They all wanted one thing: guidance. Elias took each call himself. He listened more than he spoke. He took notes in a black notebook that had once held airline itineraries but now brimmed with accounts of quiet injustice. Jalen noticed. "You're building something," he said one night, pausing in the hallway. Elias looked up. "Not building. Connecting. One story at a time." At school, Jalen had resumed his studies with a quiet confidence that surprised his teachers. The same students who once gave him odd looks now approached with respect, some even asking if he'd sign their copies of the magazine that featured his sketch. He always said no. "It's not about me," he told one classmate. "It's about what it stopped." But not everything was healing. Elias knew his son still woke up from time to time, startled by noises too loud or sudden. He knew Jalen walked a little straighter in public now, not out of pride but caution. That sketch, the one that went viral, wasn't about heroism. It was about survival, about presence in a moment when absence could have cost everything. One evening, while Elias was on a video call with an attorney who specialized in transportation law, the conversation shifted from individual cases to something larger. "You've got enough documented incidents now," the lawyer said. "Have you thought about legal advocacy? Formal structure?" Elias blinked. "You mean like a coalition?" "I mean," the man replied, "a movement." And so, the blueprints began. They called it PEAL, Passengers for Ethical Aviation Leadership. The name was Jalen's suggestion. "It sounds like something you wear," he joked. "Like armor." They laughed, but both understood the weight behind it. PEAL wasn't just a watchdog. It became a hub. Within 6 weeks, they had pro bono legal counsel from 4 major civil rights firms, over 200 testimonials from passengers, and even flight instructors quietly offering insight into internal crew protocols. A pilot from New York offered to testify anonymously about the pressure to support crew narratives over passenger complaints. A former gate agent from Texas submitted flight logs showing escalated cases dismissed without review. Elias turned their stories into a digital casebook, each entry indexed, verified, and encrypted. "Truth," he said in one press-free meeting, "deserves structure." But even as their reach grew, so did the tension. One afternoon, a sealed brown folder arrived, hand-delivered by a courier with no name tag. Inside were photographs and recordings from inside Valorn's corporate offices. A whistleblower, identity unknown, had leaked evidence that internal strategy teams were coaching crew members on acceptable justifications for escalating against visibly non-compliant minors. In one audio clip, a supervisor could be heard saying, "Just look for behaviors that will sound disruptive on paper." Elias sat in silence after listening. Then he stood, walked over to Jalen's room, and knocked. His son looked up from his sketch pad. Elias held out the file. "We have what we need," he said. "We're not just reacting anymore. We're preparing." But still, Valorn's representatives kept reaching out, this time more subtle, less official. An email suggesting a quiet roundtable discussion. A phone call from former colleague, just checking in. Elias answered none of them. The only thing he sent was a copy of Jalen's drawing, stamped in bold with the PEAL insignia. And yet, amid all the legal briefs and strategy meetings, Elias made time for a quiet moment each night. He and Jalen would sit by the kitchen window, sipping tea, watching the stars. It reminded them both of how small a plane really is and how wide the sky remains. The night before their first official summit with congressional advisors, Jalen handed his father a folded piece of paper. It was a new sketch. A passenger seated beside a window, a younger figure leaning forward in front of him, both surrounded by shadows, but shielded by a beam of light from above. Elias studied it, his voice low. "What's this one called?" Jalen hesitated, then said, "Network." Elias placed the drawing beside the first, nodding once. "This isn't about one father and one son anymore," he said. "This is a network now." The footage hit the inboxes of the Peel legal team at 8:43 a.m. A shaky voice accompanied the file. "I used to work with him. I can't stay quiet anymore." Inside a modest conference room tucked away in a civic legal center in Baltimore, Dr. Elias Merrick watched the video unfold. The sound was muffled, but the message cut like a blade. Supervisors in Valorn's crew management office could be heard coaching flight attendants on how to narrate incidents, subtly rewording events to sound like the passenger was aggressive. "Especially if he's tall, tense, or visually loud," said one voice. Another chuckled and added, "If they look disruptive, you just build a scene around it. Use non-compliant, obstructive, those buzzwords work. They won't question it." No names were mentioned, but the timestamp and internal codes matched Valorn Air's Losfar hub. And the final voice on the tape chilled Elias. It was unmistakably Grant Helker, saying, "You just need enough noise to justify the grab." Silence followed. Elias let the audio play again, slower. His jaw clenched. Around the table, four attorneys sat stunned, two jotting notes, one tapping his leg nervously. Jalen was there too, seated near the window, hoodie drawn tight around his face, sketchbook closed for once. He hadn't said a word since the file began. Elias stood. "This isn't just admissible," he said, voice even. "It's a blueprint of how they taught escalation as policy. And my son was textbook execution." The youngest attorney leaned forward. "You want this submitted to the tribunal?" Elias nodded. "Under the clause we just filed. J3A. Use the seat number." That evening, during Peel's first virtual town hall, over 200 participants signed in, teenagers, parents, solo travelers, pilots. Some shared names. Others remained muted boxes on the screen, afraid. The moderator, a quiet civil rights lawyer named Barrett Linner, introduced Elias with a reverent tone. The man who turned an assault into a movement. Elias didn't speak first. Instead, they listened. A boy named Thomas, 16, shared how he'd been denied boarding for disruptive eye contact. Another, Jaden from Chicago, recalled how he was ordered to switch seats 3 times because his assigned one had been flagged incorrectly, though the ticket said otherwise. Then came Devin, 15, who had been traveling alone to his grandmother's funeral and was denied food service after asking for ginger ale twice. "They call me persistent," he said, voice cracking, like I was threatening. Elias didn't move. He sat with his hands folded, eyes shadowed by the dim glow of his screen. Jalen, listening just off camera, looked down at his lap. For a moment, he reached for his pencil, but didn't open the sketch pad. Not yet. Barrett turned to Elias. "Dr. Merrick, would you like to close?" Elias exhaled slowly and raised his head. His voice came low, measured. "We don't just need safer skies," he said. "We need skies that honor dignity over dominance." The silence that followed was deep, steady, and unbroken for 10 whole seconds. Days later, a press release surfaced from the Federal Regulatory Ethics Board. It quoted an unlikely source, a young black violinist from Atlanta named Andre Lauren, who had testified before the board, citing the Merrick case as his reason for coming forward. "I thought no one would believe me," Andre wrote. "Then I saw a father say, 'Not this time.' That made me stand up. But the deepest twist of all had yet to land. 3 weeks after the town hall, a package arrived at Peel's temporary office with no return address. Inside, a stack of encrypted USB drives and a single note. "I was in the training room. I saw everything. You're not wrong, Dr. Merrick. We were told how to control the story." Elias scanned the drives. Over 12 hours of footage, including voice overlays, session scripts, and scenario training slides, all instructing attendants on how to neutralize narrative risk when dealing with visually disruptive minors. The wording was clinical, cold, inhuman. He walked them straight to the tribunal under sealed evidence, filed beneath the code, J3A. Jalen stood in the doorway as Elias handed over the box. The boy didn't speak, but his eyes did. They were no longer just wounded. They were sharp, focused, aware. As they left the building that afternoon, reporters lined the curb, their cameras raised, their questions flying. Elias said nothing, but Jalen turned his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They try to silence me with impact," he said quietly. Now the echoes louder than they ever expected. Elias took the stage as if stepping into a memory that had waited years to surface. The lights of a National Aviation Ethics Symposium dimmed, and a hushed silence fell over the auditorium. The backdrop screen blinked once before illuminating with bold words, "The Merrick Protocol, from impact to integrity." He stood at center stage, no notes in his hand, only the weight of what had brought him there. Cameras clicked. Pen stopped scribbling. Every eye was fixed on him. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't need to. "This isn't about retribution," Elias began, his voice even but resonant. "It's about recalibration, about dignity measured at altitude." A murmur of affirmation fluttered through the audience. Officials, safety officers, civil rights observers, and airline executives sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces tight with anticipation or dread. Elias paced slowly across the stage, his footsteps echoing like careful punctuation. Behind him, the screen listed the 10 key reforms embedded in the Merrick Protocol. Each line appeared one by one: non-confrontational de-escalation, third-party incident reporting, child protection enforcement, passenger dignity clause, each one shaped from the scar of something witnessed, endured, or narrowly escaped. Then he stopped. "But protocols are only half the truth," he said. "The other half is the story." He paused, letting the silence expand. His eyes didn't scan the room. They locked in, as if speaking directly to the memory. "Years ago," Elias said, "there was a boy. He was 10. He sat on an aisle seat with his knees tucked in. A flight attendant accused him of stealing a cookie from a service card. No investigation, no questions, just humiliation. A raised voice, a pointed finger, a warning logged into his travel record. That boy wasn't Jalen." He turned slowly, now fully facing the audience. "That boy was me." Gasps were subtle but audible. The story hadn't been shared before. His voice didn't tremble, but his hands clenched momentarily behind his back. "The difference is, no one believed me then. There were no witnesses willing to speak, no devices rolling quietly in the background. There were only echoes of adult authority drowning out a child's truth." He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, eyes steady. But someone believed Jalen. The screen behind him changed. It was a still frame, Jalen's sketch of the cabin, showing the precise moment Elias had stood between him and Grant Helker. The sketch had become a symbol, published in news outlets and educational articles. But here, in this moment, it felt wholly like testimony from the hand of the boy who had lived it. And that belief, recorded, witnessed, and protected, became the turning point. The applause rose like a storm breaking. Men in uniform stood. An ethics director in the front row wiped his eyes. But Elias raised one hand, requesting silence, not out of pride, but out of resolve. As the screen shifted again, this time listing the timeline of tribunal outcomes, the audience took in what followed. Grant Helker had been sentenced to 4 years in federal custody, forbidden from holding any public service role for life. Van Lorick was under a multi-agency ethics investigation, with subpoenaed memos and internal transcripts already surfacing. Yet Elias never once spoke their names. He moved to the podium only briefly. "This is not about shame. This is about structure. We've normalized altitude without accountability. The Merrick Protocol is not a punishment. It is a foundation." Outside the symposium, protesters held signs of support. Parents held photos of children mistreated during travel, and reporters broadcast excerpts of the speech live across networks. Jalen watched from home, seated beside a coffee table littered with his sketches, his face calm but alert. He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. He was listening. Back on stage, Elias ended with no flourish. He simply said, "We're not finished, but we've built the runway." The brass plaque gleamed beneath the terminal lights, newly mounted on the stone wall near gate C-12 at Havant International Airport. A small crowd had gathered, cordoned off by velvet ropes, as federal personnel, media crews, and travelers paused to witness the unveiling. A hushed silence fell over the space as the cover cloth was drawn back. The inscription, carved with quiet reverence, read, "In honor of every passenger who flew quietly, endured quietly, and finally spoke up. Seat 3A, Flight 728. Integrity has altitude." Jalen Merrick stood motionless in front of it, hands clasped in front of him. He wore a tailored navy jacket, his shoulders broader now, his frame taller than it had been a year ago. There was a calm determination in his eyes, a quiet strength forged in fire. Beside him stood his father, Dr. Elias Merrick, the man who had turned a single moment of violence into a national reckoning. Elias didn't smile for the cameras, but instead placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, grounding them both in the stillness of the moment. "This is your day too," Elias said, his voice low, nearly lost beneath the hum of flashbulbs and distant boarding announcements. Jalen didn't reply immediately. He was staring at the words on the plaque, as if they'd been carved into more than just metal, etched into memory. Behind them, 2 agents from the Passenger Ethics Tribunal stood in uniform silence. And further back, members of Peel mingled with education leaders and civil rights advocates. It had taken months of back-and-forth approvals, legislative red tape, and a tireless campaign from aviation ethics groups to secure this small but permanent tribute. And now it stood, bronze and bold, at the very terminal where their flight had once departed in silence. A reporter approached, but was quickly intercepted by a marshal. Elias gave a slight nod, grateful. He wasn't here for interviews. Not today. Not when the real story had always been quiet resilience. Not when the boy beside him had spent the past year learning how to breathe without flinching at the memory of impact. In the months that followed the tribunal, Jalen had stayed largely out of the public eye. Though his name had become part of federal legislation, his days had been quieter than anyone knew. Therapy sessions, sketchbooks, long walks, and careful reentry into a world that had once made him feel invisible and targeted at the same time. But what he had written during that silence had become something unexpected. His personal essay, titled "Window Seat," had been picked up by a national education consortium. The essay wasn't long, just 4 pages, but its clarity and power led to its inclusion in a new high school civics curriculum. It spoke not just of what happened on the flight, but of what it felt like to be perceived as a disruption before you'd spoken a word. Of how silence could be used both as survival and as resistance. Of how being believed could change everything. The curriculum unit now bore the title rights, dignity, and courage. And yet, Elias had turned down every spotlight. No books, no documentaries, no speeches on talk shows. He declined each one without hesitation. It was never about fame, Elias had told a senator during one proposal pitch. It was about truth, and truth doesn't need to be sold to be known. Back at the terminal, as the ceremony concluded and the small crowd began to disperse, Elias and Jalen stood alone near the edge of the terminal glass. Outside, a plane lifted into the overcast sky, its nose breaking through the mist like a promise. Elias stared at it, lost in thought. "They keep asking why you're not doing interviews," Jalen said after a while. Elias gave a faint smile. "Because we already said everything that mattered today, we refuse to stay seated." Jalen reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped item. He handed it to his father with a kind of reverence that suggested it wasn't just a drawing, it was a moment, frozen. Elias peeled the paper back and unfolded the sketch. It was pencil on textured cream stock, deeply shaded. The image showed a young man shielding another beneath a sky that was shattering like glass. The taller figure stood firm, his arm outstretched, his posture unyielding, the impact raining down but not touching the boy behind him. The sketch was silent but powerful. Elias's eyes didn't leave the image for a long time. When he finally looked at his son, There was something glassy in his gaze, pride, sorrow, endurance, all wrapped into one still breath. "What's it called?" Elias asked, his voice soft. Jalen looked at the drawing, then at his father. He didn't hesitate. Altitude of a father. Elias stared at the sketch once more, then carefully folded the paper and placed it into his briefcase. His hand lingered on the clasp before he spoke. "Some fights," Elias said, placing the sketch on the wall, "are measured not in victories, but in who stood up first." He attacked the teen and froze as the father stepped in and federal marshals swarmed the runway, ensuring accountability on the spot. If you believe true authority protects the innocent without hesitation, subscribe now, because justice always lands where it's meant to. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of accountability when wrongdoing is confronted. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.